Everyone goes through difficult times, but not everyone experiences trauma. In this video, I explain why some experiences are traumatic and others aren't. Keep watching to learn why. Hi folks, I'm Will Bratt from Heart and Oak Therapy, supporting better, brighter lives. We're therapists who do regular videos on mental wellness and give practical ideas and tips to make your life happier and more fulfilling. So hit the subscribe button to keep in the loop. It's no mystery that human beings are a diverse lot, and that's made abundantly clear by the phenomenon of trauma. Two people can be side by side experiencing the exact same event, and one person can find it distressing while the other finds it to be traumatic. So why is that? In this video, I'll be casting some light on what makes it more likely for an experience to be traumatic. In our last video, Why You Can't Just Get Over Past Trauma, I laid out what exactly it is we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. I put a link in the description, so if you haven't watched that video yet, make sure to check it out after this. Among other things, in that video, I explained that a trauma response is something that we have when we've experienced something overwhelmingly distressing, often of a terrifying nature. It's how we respond to the worst of the worst kinds of events and experiences in our lives. Now, an important nuance is that there are no set experiences that are inherently traumatic in themselves. But if it's not the event itself that defines whether an experience is traumatic, then what does? Well, let's dive into that. First off, the nature of the event itself does tie in to whether or not we're likely to experience an event as traumatic. What I mean here is that there are certain kinds of events that people are more likely to experience as overwhelmingly distressing. Events like natural disasters, motor vehicle accidents, large-scale acts of violence or terrorism, as well as interpersonal violence and experiences of abuse and mistreatment are all commonly associated with trauma responses. This doesn't mean that you absolutely will experience any one of these events as traumatic, but these do tend to be the kinds of experiences that people find to be more traumatic, more so than, say, a nearly averted car accident or an assault that you were able to stop or get away from. Another factor that can make it more likely for an adverse experience to be traumatic is if it's interpersonal in nature. While it's absolutely true that a natural disaster or an accident can be traumatic, there is something about intentional interpersonal violence or abuse that most people find to be far more distressing. This makes sense because intentional harm generally requires someone to make a decision to hurt others, whereas natural disasters or accidents are more random and not born out of an intent to harm. A lot of people find it easier to accept that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, as opposed to being a chosen victim of someone else's malicious intent. The degree of control that you have within a distressing event also ties into whether you're likely to experience it as traumatic or not. Generally speaking, the more free will that you're able to exercise, the more likely it is that you can mitigate the harm done to yourself or to other people involved. In other words, the more you're able to effectively resist, the less profoundly you're likely to feel traumatic distress in the aftermath. Social responses are another factor that often gets overlooked when we're talking about trauma, but they're absolutely relevant when it comes to the degree to which you feel post-traumatic distress. If you experience any kind of overwhelming event, whether it's interpersonal violence or abuse, or an accident or a natural disaster, and you receive positive, helpful, just social responses, you're more likely to feel okay when it's all said and done. If, on the other hand, you receive negative, blaming, shaming, ineffective, or harmful responses from others, you're more likely to struggle down the road. The reason for this is pretty simple, and it comes down to safety. Overwhelming events disrupt our sense of safety in our lives or in the world, and helpful social responses serve to restore our sense of well-being. On the flip side, negative social responses reinforce our sense of insecurity and understandably make it hard to feel at ease in our lives. Your values and the meaning that you attribute to an adverse experience or event also plays into why you might find it to be traumatic. This is a factor that's a lot more complex and nuanced than I can really illustrate in this video. There's a wide spectrum of things that contribute to the meaning that we make of an experience, including some of the factors that I've already touched on in this video. But at the risk of oversimplifying this one, I'm going to say that how you make sense of an event relates to the emotional response that you have to it. This connects closely to another factor, which is your level of sensitivity to the particular kind of adverse experience that you've had. Someone who is gradually desensitized to adverse content or experiences would likely find it to be less difficult to accept and move on from the same experience than someone with less exposure to that kind of content might. For example, a veteran paramedic might be unsettled but otherwise okay after witnessing the aftermath of a tragic accident, while a more junior paramedic might really struggle. The second last factor that plays into why some experiences are traumatic while others aren't is the intensity and duration of the experience. If you think that the more intense an adverse event is, the more likely it is that someone will find it traumatic, you're absolutely right. Of course, while all potentially traumatic experiences are unique in their own right, it's probably fair to say that it would be more traumatizing to be held hostage in a bank robbery where the robbers are brutal, ruthless, and violent versus one in which the robbers are calm, considerate, and kind, as far as bank robbers go. Similarly, it's generally assumed that adversity, like abuse, that happens once or twice and never again is likely to be less traumatizing than repeated violations over a longer period of time. Of course, there are other contextual factors as well that can contribute to how we respond to these kinds of experiences, but less is generally easier to handle than more. Finally, the last factor that can make a difference in terms of whether an experience is traumatic or not is the age at which it happened. We generally know this to be true, but children are often more vulnerable than adults. This ties into a couple of factors already mentioned in this video, like our sensitivity to kinds of adversity and our capacity to control what happens. This is clear by how we, as adults, often respond to children who are in the presence of graphic or violent content by shielding their eyes or covering their ears. I remember being a little kid and seeing violent movies that were not appropriate for someone my age and feeling really scared for some time after. Now, years later, as a grown-up, I can watch movies or TV shows with graphic content and feel somewhat unsettled, but more or less okay. While this may not exactly be an example of trauma, the analogy still fits. Because of the tendency that children have to be more sensitive and vulnerable than adults, it can be more likely that a younger person will find an overwhelmingly adverse experience to be more traumatizing. So there are 8 reasons why some experiences are traumatic and others aren't. It's a real mix of both individual and contextual factors. So, turning it over to you, the Heart Note community, I'm wondering if there are any factors or reasons that you can think of that weren't included in this video, or even if there were some factors that were mentioned that you hadn't thought of before. We'd love to hear from you, so make sure to leave a comment down below. If this video has been interesting or helpful, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button below. For more helpful videos related to therapy and mental wellness, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell notification icon to make sure you stay in the loop. Take care until next time, and keep doing the things that help you live a better, brighter life.